Picture this. You're standing in front of something that's been staring at the horizon for longer than anyone can agree on. The Great Sphinx of Giza, 240 feet long, 66 feet high. A limestone ridge so massive that it was carved out in one piece. Not built stone by stone like the pyramids, but sculpted directly from the bedrock. One giant rock. One lion head. One enigma that's been sitting there, weathering everything the desert could throw at it for who knows how long. The official story is clean and simple. Around 2500 BCE, during the 4th dynasty, Pharaoh Khafre decided his tomb needed a guardian. So his workers carved this enormous lion out of the limestone plateau at Giza. It took them a few years, maybe a decade. It made his pyramid even more impressive. It worked. It became one of the most iconic structures on Earth. The story has been taught in schools for generations. Khafre's Sphinx, 2500 BCE, done. End of discussion. Except here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean genuinely unsettling to the archaeologists who spent their entire careers defending that official timeline. Here's what gets me about this. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx don't match the story. The weathering doesn't line up. If you go to Giza and actually look at the body of the Sphinx, really study the stone, you'll see something that experts have been arguing about for decades. In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch from Boston University took a close look at those erosion patterns. Schoch is the real deal. He's done work on the Egyptian pyramid complex, he's taught at major universities, he understands geology. And when he looked at the Sphinx, he said something that made Egyptologists absolutely furious. He said the erosion pattern on that limestone body wasn't from wind and sand. That's the thing everyone assumed. Thousands of years of desert winds grinding away at the stone. But that's not what he saw. What he actually saw was vertical erosion. Deep channels running up and down the sides of the Sphinx. Not the smooth, rounded weathering you get from wind-blown sand. Not the horizontal striations of wind erosion. Vertical. Like something had been carved into the stone by water running down it. Heavy water. Over a long time. The kind of erosion you only see when you have serious prolonged rainfall beating against limestone year after year, decade after decade. Here's the problem with that observation. Egypt doesn't get that kind of rainfall anymore. Not in the Giza Plateau, not in the deserts surrounding Cairo. It hasn't had that kind of weather pattern for thousands of years. Schoch did the research. He looked at climate data. He studied the historical record. The evidence pointed to one impossible conclusion. Egypt hadn't experienced that level of rainfall for between 7,000 and 10,000 years, maybe longer. So if the Sphinx is showing erosion patterns from heavy rainfall, and Egypt hasn't had heavy rainfall in 7,000 to 10,000 years, then either something is fundamentally wrong with how we understand geology, or the Sphinx is fundamentally older than 2500 BCE. Way older. We're not talking about a few hundred years of difference here. We're potentially talking about thousands of years. Think about that for a second. That means someone, some civilization, some culture, some people with tools and vision, carved a 240-foot limestone lion into the Giza Plateau during a time when the climate was completely different. During a time when Egypt looked different. When the Nile flooded more aggressively. When rain actually fell on the desert. Before anything we recognize as Egyptian civilization even existed. The thing that really stuck with me when I first learned about this was the sheer audacity of it. Carving the Sphinx isn't like carving a statue. You can't really use a chisel and hammer for that scale. You're not chiseling away at a wall. You're removing thousands of tons of limestone from a plateau. You need engineering knowledge. You need labor organization. You need to understand the stone you're working with. You need tools. You need a reason. Who builds something like that? The mainstream Egyptological establishment's response was swift, and honestly, pretty dismissive. Mark Lehner, one of the most prominent Egyptologists working on the Giza complex, pushed back hard against Schoch's interpretation. Zahi Hawass, the former head of Egypt's Antiquities Authority, was equally defensive. They questioned his methodology. They challenged his timeline. They suggested that wind erosion, combined with other weathering processes, could explain what Schoch was seeing. They were not happy about the implications of what he was saying, and you can kind of understand why. If Schoch was right, if the erosion evidence actually meant the Sphinx predates Khafre by thousands of years, then everything changes. The entire established narrative about when Egyptian civilization emerged becomes problematic. The pharaohs, the dynasties, the timeline of human civilization in that region, it all gets shuffled. It's one thing to debate the exact date of a monument. It's another thing entirely to suggest that a civilization sophisticated enough to build the Sphinx existed 7,000 or 8,000 years before the first dynasty. Here's something important to understand, and this is where I think the academic resistance starts to make more sense, even if you disagree with it. The timeline of human civilization, as most archaeologists understand it, is based on a huge amount of connected evidence. Writing systems, pottery styles, religious iconography, genetic markers, carbon dating, stratigraphic layers, burial practices, it's all interwoven. And Egypt is one of the most thoroughly studied archaeological sites on Earth. Thousands of researchers have worked there. Thousands of papers have been written. Museums are full of artifacts that seem to fit perfectly into a clear chronological framework. When someone comes along and says the Sphinx is 3,000 years older than everyone thinks, they're not just talking about the Sphinx anymore. They're suggesting that the archaeological record is missing something massive. A civilization, a culture, a period of history that left almost no trace except for this one enormous structure. That's not a small claim. That requires extraordinary evidence. That requires a fundamental shift in how we interpret everything we think we know about ancient Egypt. But here's where it gets interesting. Shock's geological evidence is hard to dismiss. Water erosion doesn't lie. Stone tells the truth about how it's been weathered. And the more you actually look at the evidence, rather than just accepting the official narrative, the more complicated the story becomes. The erosion pattern on the Sphinx body is documented. It's measurable. It's real. And vertical water erosion is not something that happens from wind and sand over a few thousand years in a desert environment. It just isn't. That type of weathering happens when you have substantial rainfall, when you have moisture in the air, when you have water running down the stone on a regular basis, year after year, century after century. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world. Seems like I've got listeners from Tokyo to Toronto, from Sydney to Stockholm. It's wild. Anyway, back to the Sphinx and this whole geological mystery. The implications of all this started to sink in with me as I kept reading about it. If the Sphinx is older, really older, if we're talking about 5,000, 6,000, or even 10,000 years before the accepted chronology, then you're looking at a period of human history that mainstream archaeology essentially ignores. You're talking about the end of the last ice age. You're talking about the Younger Dryas. You're talking about a time when the Earth's climate was shifting dramatically, when sea levels were rising, when the world was fundamentally different than it is now. And here's what gets me, what drives me crazy about this whole thing, is that the dismissal of Shock's evidence feels less like scientific skepticism and more like protective gatekeeping. When you ask an Egyptologist why the water erosion evidence doesn't prove the Sphinx is older, they scramble to explain it away. They talk about wind erosion combined with other processes. They suggest that the specific pattern he identified could be caused by something else. But they don't offer compelling alternative explanations. They just say, no, that doesn't work, without fully engaging with the evidence. That's not how science is supposed to work. Science is supposed to follow the evidence. Science is supposed to say, here's what the stone shows. Here's what the erosion pattern tells us. Here's what that means for the chronology. Instead, what happened in the 1990s and 2000s was the Egyptological establishment circled the wagons. They protected the narrative. They marginalized Shock's research. They made it clear that if you wanted to be taken seriously, you didn't question the official Sphinx date. But the evidence didn't go away. The erosion patterns didn't change. The stone still shows the same weathering that it showed in 1990 when Shock first documented it. And more researchers started looking at his findings. Other geologists examined the Sphinx complex. They looked at the limestone enclosure walls. They studied the Sphinx temple. And guess what? The geological evidence started piling up. It wasn't just one expert with a crazy theory. It was multiple lines of evidence pointing in the same direction. Older, much older. Think of it like finding an iPhone in a medieval castle. You can try to explain it away. You can say it fell through a crack in the floor from a modern-era renovation. You can say it was planted there as a hoax. But the obvious explanation is that something doesn't add up with your understanding of the timeline. The Sphinx erosion is like that. It's screaming that something is wrong with the narrative, And ignoring that scream just because it's inconvenient isn't science, it's denial. The official explanation for the Sphinx's construction, Khafra, 2500 BCE, a pharaoh's vanity project, relies entirely on circumstantial evidence. There's a quarry nearby. There's a statue of Khafra that was found in a nearby temple. The style of the carving seems consistent with 4th dynasty work. There are hieroglyphic inscriptions that reference Khafra and the Sphinx. It all points to Khafra, so that's the story. But none of that is direct evidence. None of it actually proves when the Sphinx was carved. It's inference. It's assumption built on the framework of the accepted timeline. And when you start questioning that framework, when you actually examine what the geology shows, the whole house of cards starts to wobble, not collapse necessarily. But wobble. The cracks appear. The certainty vanishes. And what you're left with is a genuine mystery. A structure of undeniable sophistication that appears to be far older than anyone wants to admit. A challenge to everything we think we know about human civilization. The thing that Schoch did in the early 1990s was revolutionary in a very quiet way. He didn't make sensational claims. He didn't write books with exclamation points and wild theories about lost civilizations. He did what a good scientist does. He looked at the evidence carefully, he documented his findings methodically, and he presented them to the academic community. The response was almost immediate and almost entirely hostile. People in the field attacked his credibility. They questioned whether he actually understood Egyptian archaeology. But here's what's important. His evidence never went away. His data was still there. In the years that followed, other geologists would examine the Sphinx independently. They would look at the enclosure walls. They would study the weathering patterns. They would take samples. They would publish papers. And the same conclusion kept emerging from the stone itself. It's older than we've been told. The geology of the Sphinx complex is actually quite intricate when you really study it. The body of the Sphinx is carved into natural bedrock. The head was shaped from the remaining stone after the body was excavated. The enclosure, the walls around the Sphinx, these were carved out as well, and they show the same erosion patterns. The limestone is the same throughout. The weathering process would have affected all of it in the same way, and what all of it shows is water, not wind. You can test this yourself if you ever get to Giza. Look at the Sphinx body. Run your hand along it if they let you. You can feel the vertical channels. You can see how the stone has been grooved by something aggressive and persistent. Then look at the pyramids nearby. The 4th dynasty pyramids, the ones they say were built by Khafra and Khufu. The surface is much smoother. The weathering is different. The erosion pattern is consistent with what you'd expect from wind and sand over a few thousand years. But the Sphinx, it's telling a different story. Here's what really bothers the Egyptological establishment about this, and I think it's important to understand their actual concern, not just dismiss them, is that if the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by several thousand years, then you've got this orphan structure. You've got evidence of engineering sophistication that doesn't fit into the archaeological record. You've got a gap, a big gap, a gap that makes people uncomfortable. Because here's the thing about the official archaeological timeline of Egypt. It's actually pretty coherent. You can trace the development of Egyptian civilization from its earlier stages. You see the gradual complexity increase. The pottery becomes more sophisticated. The settlements become more organized. The religious symbols become more standardized. The writing system develops. You can see it happening in layers. You can point to different periods and say, here, this is where they figured out how to do this. This is where that innovation happened. It's a nice narrative. It makes sense. It flows. And then, if you accept Schoch's evidence, you throw a 240-foot limestone lion into that narrative. A lion that was built when it was still raining in the desert. A lion that was built before the dynasties. A lion that shouldn't be there according to the historical record. And nobody knows who built it or why. That breaks the narrative. That creates questions that don't have answers. That makes everyone uncomfortable. So you can understand why the academic community resisted. It's not just stubbornness, though there's definitely some of that. It's also a genuine challenge to a framework that took centuries to build. It's suggesting that our entire understanding of when Egyptian civilization emerged might be wrong. That's a big deal. That's the kind of thing that makes researchers defensive. But here's where I have to come down on this, and I'm trying to be fair to both sides. I really am. The stone doesn't lie. The geology doesn't care about the official narrative. The limestone shows what happened to it over time. Water erosion is water erosion. Vertical channels in limestone are caused by water, not wind, not sand, not time passing in a desert. Water, heavy, persistent, repeated water. If the Sphinx shows water erosion patterns that would take 7 to 10,000 years of that kind of climate to create, then the Sphinx is 7 to 10,000 years old. Or it's older. That's what the stone tells us. That's what the evidence says. You can argue about the implications, you can debate what it means for civilization, you can question whether it's really proof, but you can't argue with the weathering pattern itself. That's real. That's documented. That's measurable. And that brings us to the next question, the one that's actually more interesting than when it was built. How was it built? What tools would you need to carve something this massive? What kind of society builds a 240-foot lion for a reason that we don't understand? These are the questions that should be driving research. Not, how do we defend the established timeline, but what do these structures actually tell us about human capability and human history? That's where we're going to go next. We're going to look deeper into the geological evidence. We're going to examine what other researchers have found. We're going to see what the stone itself is actually trying to tell us. And we're going to do that right after you get comfortable, because this is the kind of story that gets better the later into the night you listen to it. So let's actually dig into what Schoch found. And I mean really dig into it, because the details matter here. The specifics are what separate reasonable skepticism from denial. Vertical water erosion. That's the key phrase. That's what he documented on the Sphinx body and the enclosure walls. When limestone is exposed to heavy rainfall over extended periods, it doesn't weather evenly. Water runs down the stone. Water seeps into small cracks. Water freezes and thaws. Over decades and centuries, this creates a very specific pattern. You get vertical channels. You get deep grooves running from top to bottom. You get a weathered surface that's almost carved by water itself. Wind erosion does something completely different. When sand and wind attack limestone, the erosion is subtle. It's gentle by comparison. It smooths the surface. It rounds the edges. It creates horizontal striations when you've got wind blowing consistently from one direction. But it doesn't carve those deep vertical channels. It doesn't create the kind of dramatic weathering you see on the Sphinx body. Wind erosion of limestone takes thousands of years to show dramatic effects. Water erosion happens much faster, much more aggressively. Here's something concrete that Schoch observed, and this is where the evidence gets really hard to dismiss. The weathering pattern on the Sphinx body is not uniform. It's worse in some places than others. The limestone that was more exposed to water running down the sides of the structure, that's where the erosion is most severe. The pattern corresponds to where water would naturally flow, where rain would accumulate, where moisture would concentrate. That's not random weathering. That's directional. That's systematic. That tells you something specific happened. Water, for a long time. Now here's where this gets really interesting. The Sphinx Temple. You've probably heard of it if you know anything about Giza. The Sphinx Temple is this structure made of massive limestone blocks that sits right in front of the Sphinx. And here's the fascinating part. Many of those blocks were cut from the same enclosure where the Sphinx sits. They're made from limestone that came from the Sphinx quarry. They're directly connected to the Sphinx carving process. And those blocks show the same erosion patterns, the same water weathering, the same vertical channels, which makes sense, right? If they were part of the same structure, exposed to the same climate for the same amount of time, they would show the same weathering patterns. But here's what's crucial. The blocks that were built into the Sphinx temple to construct walls and chambers, those interior blocks, they don't show the same weathering as the exterior surfaces. The protected blocks are less weathered. The exposed blocks are heavily weathered. That's exactly what you'd expect if this all happened during a period when there was significant rainfall. Now let's talk about the other structures at Giza for a moment, because this is where it gets really damning for the official narrative. The 4th Dynasty pyramids, Khufu's Great Pyramid, Khafre's Pyramid, Menkaur's Pyramid, they show completely different erosion patterns than the Sphinx. These structures are supposed to be from roughly the same era, maybe separated by a few decades, a few generations at most. But the erosion tells a different story. The pyramids show wind erosion. They show the smooth, rounded weathering you'd expect from being exposed to desert conditions for a few thousand years. The limestone blocks are damaged, sure. The smooth casings that once covered them are mostly gone. But the structure of the damage is consistent with wind, sand, and time. The pyramids don't show those dramatic vertical water channels. They don't show the kind of deep grooves and weathering patterns that require prolonged rainfall. So you've got the Sphinx and its complex showing water erosion patterns that suggest several thousand years of heavy rainfall, and you've got the pyramids nearby showing wind erosion patterns consistent with a few thousand years in the desert. They're in the same location, they're supposedly from the same time period. But the geology tells two completely different stories. How do you reconcile that? The mainstream Egyptological answer is basically, well, the Sphinx and the pyramid complexes were exposed to slightly different microclimate conditions. Maybe the Sphinx was in a depression that collected water. Maybe the erosion started earlier than we think, even though Khafra built it. Maybe multiple erosion processes were at work simultaneously in ways that we don't fully understand. They throw out explanations. They speculate. They offer increasingly complex theories to explain away what the geology is actually showing. But they don't have a satisfying answer. Because the satisfying answer would be to admit that the Sphinx is older, much older, and admitting that would require admitting that the entire framework of Egyptian chronology might need serious revision. That's not something that happens easily in academia, and that brings us to John Anthony West. In the 1970s, before Schoch looked at the Sphinx before any of this recent geological analysis, West was already proposing the water erosion hypothesis. West wasn't a geologist. He was an Egyptologist and a researcher with a very different perspective on Egypt. He was asking uncomfortable questions. He was looking at the monuments with fresh eyes. And he noticed what everyone else had apparently missed. The erosion pattern on the Sphinx didn't match the accepted timeline. West wrote a book called Serpent in the Sky in 1979. The book proposed that there was an ancient lost civilization in Egypt, that the Sphinx was far older than Egyptology claimed, and that the erosion evidence proved it. The academic response was pretty much what you'd expect. The book was dismissed. West was labelled a pseudo-archaeologist. The mainstream archaeological community decided he wasn't worth engaging with. But West kept publishing, he kept researching, and he kept making a compelling case based on the evidence of the stone itself. When Schoch came along in the 1990s and provided geological validation of West's observations, you'd think the academic community would have said, okay, maybe we need to reconsider this. Instead, what happened was a systematic effort to discredit Schoch's work. Mark Lehner, who was already deeply invested in the official Sphinx chronology, published papers attacking Schoch's methodology. Zahi Hawass, who was in charge of Egyptian antiquities, made it clear that Schoch's ideas weren't welcome in Egypt. The message was unmistakable. Pursue this line of research and you're risking your academic reputation. Think about that for a second. Think about how science is supposed to work. A geologist presents evidence. His evidence is examined. Either it holds up or it doesn't. If it holds up, the community adapts. The understanding changes. The timeline gets revised. But that's not what happened here. Instead, the community circled the wagons. They protected the narrative. They made it clear that disagreeing with the official chronology wasn't intellectually rigorous debate. It was heresy. Zahi Hawass was particularly influential in this process because he controlled access to the monuments. He controlled who could do research at Giza. He controlled which studies got published and which got buried, and he was absolutely hostile to the idea that the Sphinx was older than Khafra. He gave interviews. He wrote articles. He went on television defending the 2500 BCE dating like it was a matter of personal honour. Because in a way, it was. His entire career was built on the framework of Egyptian chronology. If that framework was wrong, then his work, all his research, all his authority, all his prominence, was built on a shaky foundation. Here's the thing that really bothers me about how this all played out. The evidence wasn't ever really addressed head-on. Schoch's geological analysis wasn't systematically refuted with better geology. Instead, he was attacked personally. His credibility was questioned. His motives were impugned. He was accused of sensationalism. This is classic ad hominem argumentation. Instead of dealing with the evidence, you discredit the person presenting it. And the evidence just kept accumulating. Other geologists have examined the Sphinx over the years. Not all of them agree with Schoch's exact conclusions. Some think the timeline might not be quite as old as he suggests. But the overwhelming consensus among geologists who have actually studied the structure is that the water erosion is real, that it's significant, that it indicates an age older than 2500 BCE. The geological evidence is now documented in multiple peer-reviewed papers. It's reproducible, it's observable, anyone can go to Giza and look at it themselves. Yet the Egyptological establishment has largely just pretended it doesn't exist. You won't find the water erosion hypothesis in most textbooks. You won't find it in museum displays. You won't find it being taught to archaeology students as a serious theory. It's been essentially blacklisted from mainstream academic discourse, not because it's been disproven, but because it's inconvenient. Now, I want to be fair here. I really do. There are legitimate questions about Schoch's timeline estimates. Geological dating can have significant margins of error. When he says the erosion pattern suggests an age of 5,000 to 7,000 BCE, or possibly older, those numbers are estimates. They could be off by a few hundred years. They could be off by more. That's a fair criticism. But even if you're skeptical of the exact numbers, the core argument remains. The erosion pattern indicates an age older than 2,500 BCE. Even if you think it's 4,000 BCE instead of 10,000 BCE, you're still looking at a structure that predates dynastic Egypt by over 1,000 years. That's still a major revision to the accepted chronology. That's still a civilization that we don't have any other archaeological evidence for. That's still a gap in the historical record. And that's still something that the Egyptological establishment has essentially refused to confront. Here's another detail that's worth considering, because it's one of the technical arguments that Schoch made that gets less attention than the general water erosion claim. When limestone is carved and exposed to the elements, the freshly exposed stone and the old exposed stone weather at different rates initially. The fresh surface, the newly carved limestone that's going to weather faster at first. It's going to show rapid erosion patterns early on, but after a certain amount of time passes, the weathering becomes more uniform. You reach an equilibrium. The older exposed surfaces and the newer exposed surfaces start to look similar again. This process takes time, centuries at least. This is another way that geologists can estimate age, by looking at the consistency of weathering patterns across different parts of a structure, and by understanding how those patterns evolve over geological time. The Sphinx doesn't show the kind of variation you'd expect if different parts of it were carved at different times. It shows relatively consistent weathering patterns, which means either everything was carved at roughly the same time, or enough time has passed that the weathering is equilibrated. That time frame, based on climate models and erosion rates, is much longer than 4,500 years. It's much longer than even a few thousand years ago. It's consistent with a much more ancient date. The implication of all this geological evidence taken together is really quite profound. We have a structure that was built by someone with sophisticated engineering knowledge. A structure that was built during a climate period that Egypt hasn't experienced in thousands of years. A structure that nobody can explain within the framework of accepted Egyptological chronology. Either we accept that there was a pre-dynastic civilization that we know almost nothing about, or we accept that our entire understanding of the Sphinx is wrong. There's one more piece of this geological puzzle that deserves attention, the Sphinx temple again. Not just the weathering pattern of the blocks, but their arrangement. The blocks were clearly cut from the bedrock of the Sphinx enclosure. They were moved, some of them hundreds of meters, to build the temple. The architectural style of the temple matches 4th dynasty structures. The decoration and artwork match that era. So the temple is definitely from the dynastic period. Someone from the 4th dynasty, probably from Khafra's time, built this temple using blocks they quarried from the Sphinx enclosure. But here's what that means. It means that at the time the temple was built, the Sphinx was already ancient. It was already weathered. It was already eroded in the way we see it today. Because if the Sphinx had been carved freshly, if it had just been completed by Khafra, the quarrying process that cut those temple blocks would have removed the weathered exterior and left fresh stone underneath. But the temple blocks, the ones that were quarried from the enclosure, they show the same heavy weathering as the rest of the Sphinx complex, which means the weathering happened before the temple was built, so the timeline becomes Sphinx is carved. Sphinx weathers for thousands of years. Temple is built in 4th dynasty using Sphinx enclosure blocks. You can't escape that sequence. The geology forces it on you. That's the evidence. That's what the stone tells us. That's what multiple geologists have documented and verified. It doesn't prove exactly when the Sphinx was built. It doesn't give us a definitive date. But it absolutely proves that 2,500 BCE is too recent. The Sphinx is old. Much older. Possibly older than civilization itself, depending on how you define civilization. But here's where I want to bring this back to something more personal, more immediate. This matters. The question of who built the Sphinx and when and how, These aren't just academic debates for people in university departments. These are questions about human history, about human capability, about what our ancestors could do, about what we've forgotten or lost track of. If there was a civilization 7 or 10,000 years ago that could engineer and build something as massive and complex as the Sphinx, that changes everything we think we know about human development. That suggests a knowledge base that we've lost. That suggests capabilities that supposedly didn't exist yet. That's profound. And the fact that this evidence gets marginalized, dismissed and buried, that bothers me. That bothers me a lot. Not because I think Egyptologists are bad people or stupid. Most of them are thoughtful, intelligent, dedicated researchers. But they're also human. They're invested in frameworks. They're part of an academic tradition that has a lot of institutional weight behind it. And challenging that weight, even with good evidence, is difficult. It comes at a cost. Schoch paid that cost. His work on the Sphinx became almost a sideshow to his actual geological research. He's done plenty of legitimate geological work that has nothing to do with the Sphinx. But he's been defined, in many people's minds, by this one controversial claim. Wes paid a cost too. He became a figure of ridicule in mainstream archaeology. His other work was overshadowed by the controversy around the Sphinx dating, but the stone is still there. The erosion pattern is still there. And every year that passes, every new study, every new piece of geological evidence, it all points in the same direction. Older. The Sphinx is older than we've been told. What does that mean for Egyptian civilization? What does it mean for human history? How do we integrate a pre-dynastic structure of such sophistication into our understanding of human development? These are the questions that should be driving research. Not defending an established date, but actually understanding what this structure is and what it means. Those are the real questions. That's where the genuine intellectual curiosity should be pointing. And that raises another question that's even more interesting, arguably the most interesting question in all of this. If the Sphinx is indeed that old, if it was built around 10,500 BCE, or even 5,000 BCE, what was it built for? Why? What purpose did it serve? The Sphinx is a lion. It faces due east toward the rising sun at the equinox. It's monumentally large. We talked about this earlier, but it really can't be overstated. The scale is staggering. It's unbelievably labor-intensive to carve without modern machinery. You don't build something like that without a reason, without a culture that values it, without a civilization that understands it and prioritizes it enough to dedicate massive resources to it. Maybe the answer lies in the night sky. Maybe the answer lies in the stars. Maybe the people who built the Sphinx were building it to commemorate something in the heavens, something astronomical, something that mattered enough to them to carve a 240-foot lion into the desert bedrock. And if we follow that thread, if we look at what was happening in the sky at different times in history, we start to see a story that's even more astonishing than the geology alone. Let's talk about the sky. Because if you want to understand why the Sphinx exists, why someone went through the enormous effort of carving a 240-foot limestone lion into the Giza Plateau, why they poured so much time and resources and knowledge into creating this monument, you need to look up, not down at the ground, not at the archaeology, up, to the heavens, to the stars. Because the Sphinx isn't just pointing at the ground, it's pointing at something in the sky. The Sphinx faces due east. That's not random. That's not arbitrary. That's intentional. It's oriented precisely toward the point where the sun rises. But more specifically, and this is crucial, it's oriented toward the point where the sun rises on the equinox, when day and night are equal length. Not on the summer solstice or the winter solstice, but specifically on the equinox. That's the kind of precision that tells you something important about the people who built it. They were watching the sky. They understood the cycles. They knew how to calculate and measure. They cared enough about alignment to orient their monument toward an astronomical event that only happens twice a year. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The direction the sun rises at the equinox doesn't change. The sun rises due east at the spring and autumn equinoxes, always has, always will. That's a fundamental fact of astronomy. But what's behind the sun, what constellation is rising at that same moment, that changes. And it changes in a very specific way, following a pattern that ancient astronomers understood. This pattern is called precession. The precession of the equinoxes is caused by a slow wobble in Earth's axis. Think of it like a spinning top that's slowly wobbling as it spins. That wobble means that the point in the night sky where the sun appears to rise at the spring equinox shifts very gradually over time. It doesn't shift fast, it shifts slowly. Really slowly. It takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle, so in each human lifetime you barely notice it. But over centuries and millennia, the shift becomes apparent. The 26,000-year cycle is divided into 12 sections, roughly, and each section corresponds to one of the constellations of the zodiac. We call these sections astrological ages: the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. You've probably heard that term before. These ages last about 2,150 years each. During the age of Pisces, for example, the constellation Pisces rises behind the sun at the spring equinox. Before that was the age of Aries, and before that was the age of Taurus. Now, here's where this connects directly to the Sphinx. When Egyptian chronology says the Sphinx was built around 2500 BCE, the precession of the equinoxes placed the constellation Taurus rising at the spring equinox. Taurus, a bull. There are indeed bull symbols throughout Egyptian culture. The Apis bull is important in Egyptian religion. Bulls appear in Egyptian artwork and mythology. So the official chronology makes a kind of sense. Bull age, bull symbolism, probably Khafra's time. But what if you go back much, much further? What if you go back to around 10,500 BCE? At that time, the precession placed a completely different constellation rising at the spring equinox. It placed Leo, the lion. The great celestial lion was rising where the sun would rise on the spring equinox. The Sphinx faces due east toward that sunrise point. The Sphinx is a lion. The constellation that would have been rising there at that exact moment, at the spring equinox in 10,500 BCE, was Leo. Is that a coincidence? Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The Sphinx is a lion. It faces east toward the sunrise. The person who built it cared enough about alignment to orient it precisely. And at 10,500 BCE, the moment when the precession of the equinoxes placed the constellation Leo at the spring equinox, that's also the moment when a sphinx, a monument carved as a lion, would make perfect astronomical sense. It would be pointing directly at the constellation it represents. It would be commemorating that exact moment in the precessional cycle. It would be saying, this is our time, this is when we live, this is what we see in the sky, a permanent, eternal monument to a moment in history. This observation, this connection between the Sphinx and Leo, between the monument and the moment in time, comes largely from John Anthony West, whom we mentioned earlier. West wasn't looking at just the Sphinx in isolation. He was looking at the entire Giza complex, all the monuments, all the structures, all the alignments, and he saw a pattern, a comprehensive pattern, a system. That pattern was studied more systematically by Robert Bauval, a researcher and engineer who has spent decades studying the astronomical alignments of the Giza complex. Bauval approached this from an engineer's perspective: precise measurements, mathematical verification, testing hypotheses. He looked at more than just the Sphinx. He looked at the pyramids, all three of the main pyramids at Giza, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. Their relative positions on the ground, their spacing, their angles, their relationship to each other. When you look down at them from above, when you study the geometry of their placement, their relative positions match the relative positions of the three stars in Orion's belt precisely. Not approximately, not roughly, precisely. The same spacing between the stars matches the same spacing between the pyramids, the same angles, the same proportions. It's as if someone took a map of Orion's belt and scaled it up to fit the Giza plateau. Now, Orion's belt appears in the night sky above us, three bright stars in a line, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. They're one of the most recognizable star patterns in the heavens. Nearly every human civilization has noticed them. Nearly every culture has stories about them. But at Giza, the three pyramids sit on the ground in the exact same configuration. The same spacing, the same relative positions, the same brightness ratios when you compare star brightness to pyramid size. That's not something that happens by accident. That's not coincidence. That's intentional design. That's someone saying, we want our monuments to match the sky. We want future generations to understand the connection. And Bauval did the calculations, he did the precessional analysis. He worked out the mathematics of how the correlation shifts over time as the precession changes the sky. And he found something remarkable. The Orion correlation, the match between the three stars in Orion's belt and the three pyramids, that correlation is most perfect, most precise, at one particular moment in history. One moment when the match is absolute. When the pyramids below mirror the stars above without any distortion or variation. That moment was around 10,500 BCE, the same date the Sphinx's Leo alignment points to, the same time frame the geological erosion evidence suggests. All of these different lines of evidence converging on the same moment in history. So you've got the Sphinx as the lion, representing Leo. You've got the three pyramids arranged as Orion's belt, representing Orion. And the entire configuration is aligned to the sky as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. The whole Giza complex is a map, a 3D model of the heavens at a specific moment in time. A moment in time that matches the geological evidence suggesting the Sphinx is at least 7,000 years older than the official dating. Here's what gets me about this. Here's what really gets me. This kind of astronomical knowledge requires serious observation, serious mathematics, serious understanding of the heavens. You don't figure out that Leo was rising at the spring equinox in 10,500 BCE by accident. You don't design an entire monument complex to match the stars without understanding how the stars move over time. You don't build a Sphinx as a representation of Leo unless you know what constellation was important at the time you were building it. The precession of the equinoxes isn't obvious. It's not something you see in your lifetime. It's not something you figure out without centuries of careful observation and record keeping. You need a civilization that values astronomy. You need a tradition of knowledge keeping. You need to be able to pass information down across generations. You need tools, you need mathematics, you need writing, probably, though you could theoretically maintain complex knowledge through oral tradition if you were careful enough. But you'd need to be very careful. The fact that the Giza complex appears to encode this information suggests a civilization of significant sophistication, a civilization that could observe the night sky over extended periods, that could do mathematical calculations to figure out past and future precession, that could design and execute a massive engineering project to immortalize that knowledge in stone. A civilization, in other words, that was doing exactly what the geological evidence suggests, existing thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. Graham Hancock is another researcher who's done extensive work on this topic. Hancock has explored the idea of a lost civilization that existed before the climate-driven catastrophe that ended the last ice age, the Younger Dryas. This was a period, roughly 12,800 to 11,500 years ago, when the Earth went through rapid and dramatic climate change. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't slow, it was abrupt. It got cold again, suddenly, dramatically. Within decades, perhaps. The climate shifted. The weather patterns changed. Glaciers that had been melting stopped melting or reversed. It caused environmental collapse in many parts of the world. Entire ecosystems broke down. There was massive flooding as the climate dynamics shifted and water released from melting ice suddenly stopped flowing. Seasonal patterns changed. It may have caused the extinction of large mammals like the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed cat. It definitely caused the extinction of the Clovis people in North America. A culture that had been successful for centuries suddenly collapsed. And it would have affected human populations globally. Coastal populations would have been devastated. Hunting strategies would have ceased working. Settlements would have become uninhabitable. Hancock's thesis, developed over multiple books and research projects, is that there was a sophisticated civilization before this catastrophe. Not just isolated pockets of people, but a genuine civilization, interconnected, maritime-based, capable of ocean travel, trading with each other across vast distances, a civilization with writing, probably, with architecture, with astronomy, with mathematics, a civilization that fell apart during the Younger Dryas. Not all at once, but across generations, as the climate shift destroyed the infrastructure they depended on. The survivors spread out. They tried to preserve their knowledge. They built monuments. They carved the knowledge into stone so that when their civilization fell, when the libraries burned, when the knowledge was lost to time, at least the monuments would remain. At least future generations could potentially understand where their ancestors came from. At least the stones would remember. The Sphinx could be part of that story. A monument built before the catastrophe, or built just after, as a memory and a tribute to the civilization that came before. A marker, a way of saying, we were here, we knew the stars, We understood the cycles. We understood the precession. We had mathematics. We had engineering. We built something that will last forever. A message to the future. The Younger Dryas ended around 11,500 years ago. The climate stabilized. The warming resumed. Civilization could rebuild. Around 10,500 BCE is when things began to stabilize. Around 10,500 BCE, in Hancock's and Bauval's timeline, is when the survivors of that ancient civilization could have built monuments to commemorate what they'd lost. The Sphinx, the pyramids, the entire Giza complex as a map of the heavens, a message in stone, the connection between the geological dating, the astronomical alignment, and the historical catastrophe of the Younger Dryas. That convergence is striking. It's not proof. It doesn't definitively prove anything on its own, but taken together, it's evidence. It's a pattern. It's a story that connects multiple independent lines of inquiry into one coherent narrative. Geology, astronomy, climate history, and archaeology, all pointing in the same direction, all converging on the same conclusion. That's significant. That deserves serious academic attention. That deserves research, not dismissal. Think about what was happening on Earth at that time. This is crucial to understanding the whole picture. The last ice age had ended. The world was warming up after thousands of years of cold. The continents were taking the shape we recognize today. The ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere were melting. Sea levels were rising, and they were rising dramatically. We're talking about changes of hundreds of feet. Massive amounts of water released from melting ice. Coastlines that had been dry were suddenly submerged. Geography was changing in real time. If there was a civilization that lived on coastlines, that built cities by the sea, that developed a maritime culture, a lot of that evidence would be underwater now, submerged, under hundreds of feet of water, under sediment, buried, hidden from archaeology because the archaeology hasn't looked deep enough, or because the evidence is literally at the bottom of the ocean in places we haven't explored. What if the Sphinx is one of the few remaining above-ground monuments from that era? What if the pyramids are later constructions, built by the ancestors of that lost civilization, using techniques and knowledge that were passed down? What if dynastic Egypt wasn't the invention of civilization, but rather the remnant of something much older? The continuation, in new form, of something that came before? These are the questions that the astronomical evidence raises. These are the implications of the Orion correlation and the Leo alignment. These are the threads that scholars like Hancock and Bauval have been pulling on for decades. And the more you pull, the more the entire accepted narrative of human history seems to unravel. Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing that bothers me most about how this research is treated in mainstream academia. These are not crazy ideas. They're not pseudoscience. They're not fringe conspiracy theories. These are serious researchers asking serious questions based on serious evidence. Bauval was an engineer before he was an archaeologist. He understands construction. He understands precision. He wouldn't have pursued the Orion correlation if he wasn't sure of his measurements. West, despite being dismissed by the mainstream, was clearly intelligent and knowledgeable about Egypt. Hancock is a thorough researcher who bases his conclusions on evidence, not speculation. But they're all marginalized, all treated as outsiders, all dismissed by the mainstream because their conclusions are inconvenient, because their ideas challenge the established framework, because the implications are too large, too disruptive to the current academic consensus. The irony is that archaeology is supposed to be in the business of discovering new things, of revising our understanding of the past when evidence demands it, of making new connections, of finding evidence that changes what we thought we knew, of following the data where it leads. But when researchers try to do that, when they present evidence that the accepted timeline is wrong, they don't get engaged with seriously. They get attacked. They get marginalized. They get excluded from academic circles. The system that's supposed to pursue truth has instead become protective of a particular version of truth, a version that's comfortable, a version that's been taught for generations, a version that benefits the people who've built their entire careers on defending it. The Sphinx is still there. It still shows the same erosion patterns. It's still aligned with Leo at 10,500 BCE. The pyramids are still arranged as Orion's belt. The geometry is still precise, the astronomy is still correct, the evidence hasn't gone away. And as you're sitting with all of this information, as you're thinking about what it means, As you're contemplating the possibility of a lost civilization watching the same stars you see tonight, you might start to feel that sense of wonder, that sense of awe, that sense that maybe, just maybe, human history is far more mysterious and far more ancient than we've been taught. And that's where we are now. That's the current state of understanding about the Sphinx. We have geological evidence suggesting it's older. We have astronomical evidence suggesting it's much older. We have historical context suggesting that the time period it seems to represent was a time of global catastrophe and climate change. We have researchers making serious evidence-based arguments that human civilization is older and more sophisticated than conventional archaeology admits. And we have an established academic system that essentially refuses to engage with any of this, which means the mystery remains. The Sphinx continues to sit there watching the sunrise, keeping its secrets, the same way it has for thousands of years, the same way it will for thousands of years to come. So here's where it gets really interesting. If the Sphinx is 10,000 years old or older, we have to ask ourselves one fundamental question. Who built it? This is the question that keeps me up at night. Not in an anxious way, but in that electric way where your mind is just racing through possibilities. In 10,500 BCE, according to mainstream history, humans were hunter-gatherers. They didn't have civilization. They didn't have agriculture. They didn't have writing. They had spears and fire and mobile camps that followed the animals. They certainly didn't have the architectural knowledge, the geometric precision, or the organizational structure to move millions of tons of limestone blocks and arrange them into a massive monument that aligns perfectly with the stars. That's the official story, that's what we're told. And for a long time it made sense because we had no evidence of anything else. But then something happened that shook everything up. In 1994, archaeologists in Turkey discovered a place called Göbekli Tepe. Here's what gets me about Göbekli Tepe. It's a temple complex with massive carved stone pillars, T-shaped, standing 20 feet tall, some weighing 16 tons, and it was built around 9,600 BCE. Let that sink in. This wasn't a simple pile of rocks. This was a sophisticated construction with astronomical alignments, artistic precision, and evidence of organized labor. The part that doesn't make sense is that it was built by what we used to call primitive people, hunter-gatherers, people with no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no written language, and yet they managed to quarry, carve, transport and arrange stones with more skill than most modern builders without power tools. Göbekli Tepe changed everything. It forced archaeologists to rethink what human societies were capable of in the early period. It blew open the timeline of human civilization. And it's not just Göbekli Tepe. Look deeper. In Indonesia, there's a site called Gunung Padang, a mountain that may be an ancient pyramid structure, partially buried under earth and vegetation for thousands of years. Carbon dating suggests human activity there going back to around 24,000 years ago. Off the coast of Japan, there are underwater structures called Yonaguni, massive stone formations on the seafloor that could be natural, or could be the remnants of a civilization that existed before the oceans rose and swallowed it. And off the coast of India, researchers have found submerged cities, underwater ruins that suggest organized settlements existed where there's now only water. The pattern is everywhere we look. Whenever we really dig, whenever we really search with modern technology, we find that civilization seems to be older than we thought. It's like every assumption we've made keeps getting pushed backward in time. This is where things get strange, really strange. Plato wrote about something called Atlantis, a civilization he described as advanced, sophisticated and ultimately destroyed. He placed its destruction around 9,600 BCE. Now, we don't know if Atlantis was real or if Plato invented it as a philosophical allegory. Scholars debate this constantly. But here's the detail that keeps me up at night. That date. 9,600 BCE. That's the exact same period when Göbekli Tepe was being built. That's the same period when, according to geological evidence, something catastrophic happened on Earth. We're talking about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Around 10,800 BCE, evidence suggests that a comet or asteroid struck the Earth, or perhaps multiple impacts occurred. The results were devastating. Massive flooding, wildfires across continents, climate disruption, tsunamis that would make modern natural disasters look like gentle waves. This cataclysm lasted roughly 1,200 years. Here's what I want you to consider. What if a civilization existed before this impact? What if there were sophisticated societies in 11,000 or 12,000 BCE that were wiped out by this cosmic event? What if that's why we don't find their remains easily? The oceans rose dramatically after the Ice Age. Land that was once habitable is now underwater. Settlements that existed on ancient coastlines are now 100 feet beneath the sea. Historical records would be destroyed or buried under layers of sediment and silt. But their monuments, the ones built from stone, the ones built to last, those might still be there, still standing, still watching. The Sphinx fits this timeline perfectly. If it was built before 10,000 years ago, before the impact and flooding, before the climate stabilized, then it could be evidence of exactly this kind of lost civilization. Think about it from an engineering perspective. The amount of knowledge required to build the Sphinx was immense. You need to understand proportion, perspective, three-dimensional geometry. You need to know how stone responds to different tools and techniques. You need to organize thousands of workers, move them, feed them, coordinate them. This isn't random. This isn't something you figure out by accident. This is accumulated knowledge. This is a tradition of builders who learned from other builders, which means there's a history before the Sphinx, there's a development period. If the Sphinx was built in 10,500 BCE, that suggests a building tradition that goes back even further, maybe to 11,000 BCE or 12,000 BCE, and what was happening to these civilizations? What were they doing with this knowledge? The geological evidence supports this. The Younger Dryas impact would have caused massive environmental disruption. Climates shifted. Ocean levels changed by hundreds of feet. Populations would have been displaced. Records would be lost. Technologies might be forgotten. Maybe that's why we see this gap, this dark period in human history between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE. Maybe we're not seeing the full picture because half of it is underwater or buried under sediment. Maybe the Sphinx is a survivor, a remnant, a stone monument left by a civilization that vanished in the catastrophe. The fascinating part is that this doesn't make the builders less advanced or less intelligent. If anything, it makes them more impressive. They were navigating a world of sudden climate change, rising waters, and environmental chaos. They built monuments that lasted through all of that. That's remarkable. That's testament to their skill. And it raises profound questions about why we lost this knowledge. Why did civilization have to start over? Why does the historical record begin in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 5000 BCE, when we have evidence of sophisticated construction techniques thousands of years earlier? This is where the conversation gets complicated. Mainstream archaeology pushes back hard against this timeline. They point out that we don't have conclusive proof. We have correlations and possibilities, but not definitive evidence. And they're not wrong to ask for evidence. That's what science demands. But here's the thing. The evidence keeps mounting. Every new discovery, every new technology, every time we look more carefully at the Earth's geological history, we find things that challenge the conventional timeline. Göbekli Tepe did that. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis did that. The discovery of submerged cities did that. And the water erosion on the Sphinx is doing that right now, in real time, forcing us to rethink when it was built. Let me paint a picture of what this means. Imagine you're an archaeologist in 1950, and everything you've been taught, everything that's in the textbooks, says that Egypt began with the Old Kingdom around 2686 BCE. The first dynasties, the first pyramids. Before that, nothing. Or at least, that's what the official story was. Then you see the Sphinx, you look at the erosion patterns, you measure the geological composition, and something doesn't match. The Sphinx doesn't fit the timeline you've been given. It's old, much older. The face looks wrong for the era it's supposedly from. The body proportions suggest it wasn't originally a human face at all. This is the cognitive dissonance that makes people uncomfortable. It forces us to question the entire framework we've built our understanding on. What's more, if we accept that a lost civilization existed and was wiped out by the Younger Dryas impact, we have to ask, what was their technology? How advanced were they? The precision of the Sphinx's construction is extraordinary. The angles are perfect. The proportions follow geometric laws. The alignment with Orion's belt, if that's intentional, demonstrates astronomical knowledge. If this was built by people in 10,500 BCE, those people knew things that we didn't rediscover until thousands of years later. They had knowledge we can barely replicate today. Where did that come from? How long did it take to develop? What other buildings did they construct that we haven't found yet? This is where the conversation becomes almost spiritual, or at least philosophical. Because if there was a golden age of human achievement that was wiped out by catastrophe, that's not just ancient history. That's a story about the fragility of civilization. That's a story about knowledge being lost and having to be learned again from scratch. That's a story that resonates deeply with us now, in this era where we're watching climate change and wondering what kind of world we're leaving behind. Our ancestors, if this theory is correct, had to survive an extinction-level event and begin civilization anew. They built the Sphinx to remember. They built it to last. Some researchers suggest that monuments like the Sphinx and the pyramids that came later were deliberate attempts to encode knowledge in stone, in a form that would survive catastrophe. Think about that. If you're living in a world where you've just experienced a cosmic impact, where vast civilizations have been destroyed, where knowledge has been lost, you might decide to preserve your most important information in the most durable way possible. Not in papyrus. Paper decays. Not in books. They burn. Not in digital storage. It requires electricity and technology that can fail. Stone. You carve it into stone. You build it into monuments that are so massive, so impressive, so permanent that future generations will study them and try to understand. The Sphinx could be exactly that. A message in stone passed down from a vanished world. Consider the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis more deeply for a moment. Around 10,800 BCE, geological evidence indicates that fragments of a comet struck Earth. Some researchers believe it was a single massive impact. Others suggest a series of impacts over a span of years. The results were cataclysmic. We're talking about impact sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Fireballs that turned night into day, tsunamis hundreds of feet tall, wildfires that blackened the skies with soot and ash. The sun was obscured. Temperatures dropped rapidly. The ice ages came back, at least temporarily, in what's called the Younger Dryas cold period. Agriculture, which had just begun, was devastated. Populations collapsed. Civilizations that had taken centuries to build were wiped out in months. Some researchers estimate that 70% of large mammals went extinct. The world was fundamentally transformed. If humans had built sophisticated societies by this point, those societies would have been destroyed or scattered beyond recognition. The questions multiply the more you think about it. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Were they ancestors of the Egyptians who built the pyramids thousands of years later? Did the knowledge of their existence get passed down in myths and legends? Is that where stories of the gods came from, not supernatural beings, but the advanced humans of the pre-cataclysm world? Were they seafarers who travelled across the oceans, building monuments in different places? Is that why we find similar structures and similar patterns in different parts of the world? The pyramids in Egypt, the pyramids in Central America, the geometric precision in structures we've found in Asia? Were these all built by people who learned from the same tradition, the same knowledge system? There's a concept in archaeology called diffusionism versus independent development. Diffusionism suggests that technology and knowledge spread from one culture to another through contact and trade. Independent development suggests that different cultures, separated by geography, invented similar things on their own because they face similar problems. Most of the time we see elements of both. But when you look at the Sphinx, and then look at similar monuments in other parts of the world, the precision and the sophistication make you wonder. The Egyptian pyramids show an evolution. The earlier pyramids, the bent pyramid and the step pyramids, were experimental. They show the builders learning and improving. But the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, these show mastery. These show a tradition that was already well established. What if that tradition goes back to the pre-impact world? What if it's a knowledge that survived the catastrophe, passed down through survivors, and then expressed again in the Egypt we know? That would explain why the Sphinx looks so strange, so out of place in the Old Kingdom context. It would explain why the erosion pattern suggests it's older than the pyramids. It would explain why the engineering is so perfect, so different from the experimental pyramids that came after. The Sphinx wasn't an experiment. It was a masterwork from a master tradition. A tradition that had seen civilizations fall and rise and fall again, and knew how to build monuments that would last forever. The frustrating part is that we don't have the answers. We have evidence and questions and possibilities, but not definitive proof. And that's exactly the kind of situation that drives human curiosity. It's the kind of mystery that makes us want to explore further, to dig deeper, to search for the truth even when the establishment tells us we're wasting our time. That's the spirit that's animated archaeology for centuries, not accepting what we're told, but asking why, questioning, looking at the physical evidence with fresh eyes, refusing to let old assumptions block new understanding. Think about what we'd have to uncover to prove this. We'd need evidence of settlements from that period. We'd need tools. We'd need records or artifacts. But here's the problem. After 12,000 years, after flooding, after the Younger Dryas catastrophe, after the settling of new populations, after the build-up of sand and sediment in places like Egypt, how much evidence would actually be preserved? Not much. Most of it would be destroyed or buried beyond our current ability to reach it. What would survive? Stone monuments, structures too massive to be completely destroyed. The Sphinx fits that profile perfectly. It's not evidence that proves everything, it's evidence that suggests a possibility. And that possibility is compelling enough to demand further investigation. The Sphinx, in this context, isn't just a monument to a pharaoh from 4,500 years ago. It's a potential artifact from a lost era, a marker, a beacon, a monument left by people who wanted the world to know they were here. They built things, they understood things, they existed, even if their names are forgotten and their cities are at the bottom of the ocean. That's profound. That's the kind of history that changes how we see ourselves. Not as the pinnacle of civilization looking back at primitive ancestors, but as one chapter in a much longer story. A story that includes rises and falls, knowledge gained and lost, civilizations that built monuments to outlast them, just hoping that someday someone would understand. The beauty of this mystery is that it doesn't require you to reject mainstream archaeology entirely. It requires you to expand it, to acknowledge that the timeline might be longer than we thought, to accept that human civilization might be more ancient, more developed and more complex than the textbooks say, to embrace the idea that there might be chapters in human history that we haven't read yet because the pages are underwater or buried under desert sand. Some of the most respected archaeologists are starting to come around to this perspective. The evidence is piling up too high to ignore. Göbekli Tepe changed minds. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis changed minds. New technologies like LIDAR, which can see through jungle canopy to reveal hidden structures, are revealing civilizations we didn't know existed. The conversation is shifting. Slowly, yes. Academia moves slowly. But it's shifting. When you look at the Sphinx from this perspective, it becomes less about a pharaoh trying to impress people with his power, and more about something deeper. It becomes evidence of a human need to build something that lasts, to create something permanent in a world of change, to say to the future, we were here, we built this, we knew things, we wanted you to know that we existed. That's a fundamentally human impulse, and it's one that shows up in cultures across the world, in different forms at different times: monuments, pyramids, stone circles, statues, carvings, all of them saying the same thing: remember us. And here's what gets me the most. When you stand in front of the Sphinx, and I hope you get to do this someday, you feel that message. You feel the weight of time. You sense that something ancient is looking at you. There's a presence there that transcends explanation. Whether it was built 4,500 years ago or 12,000 years ago, it's still one of the most impressive structures humans have ever created. The stone is worn in ways that suggest exposure to water. The proportions are perfect. The alignment is precise. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Whoever built it, whenever they built it, they were extraordinary. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. And that story might be much older and much stranger than we ever imagined. If you're still awake and enjoying this, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep. These recommendations make a huge difference in getting our content in front of more night owls and insomniacs who are searching for something that helps them relax. Now, back to the mystery. Because we're about to get into the really specific stuff, the hidden chambers, the evidence that's been buried, literally buried, beneath the Sphinx's pores, the secrets that archaeologists have found and in some cases have been reluctant to discuss. That's where the real story gets interesting. That's where we start to understand what might actually be hidden beneath the sand. So let's talk about what's actually beneath the Sphinx. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. The Sphinx itself is a time capsule. Not intentionally maybe, but functionally. It's a monument that's been altered, rebuilt, covered, uncovered, and hidden throughout history. And each layer of that history tells us something. The Sphinx wasn't always visible. It wasn't always respected. In fact, for much of ancient history, it was buried. Sand dunes in Egypt can be massive. They shift with the wind. They bury things. They unbury things. The Sphinx was buried up to its neck for centuries at a time. Nobody was looking at it. Nobody was studying it. It was just a massive stone head sticking out of the desert. And then it wasn't even that anymore, it was just sand. Imagine that. The largest stone monument in the world, a structure that took enormous effort to carve, and it's just buried under sand. Forgotten. Hidden from view. That happened multiple times. The Sphinx was excavated in medieval times. Then it got buried again. It was excavated during the colonial period. Then sand accumulated around it again. It wasn't until the 20th century that the Sphinx was permanently excavated and maintained. Before that, it was a hidden thing, a mysterious thing, a lion's head or a pharaoh's head sticking out of the dunes, watching over a desert that was slowly consuming it. That's a profound image when you think about it, this ancient monument, buried, waiting, eroding, being slowly reclaimed by the desert, until people finally decided to uncover it and preserve it. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's something called the Dream Stele. It's a granite slab about 7 feet tall, and it sits right between the Sphinx's front paws. It was placed there by a pharaoh named Thutmose IV around 1400 BCE. And on that stele, Thutmose wrote something fascinating. He wrote about having a dream where the Sphinx spoke to him. The Sphinx complained that it was being buried in sand and asked Thutmose to excavate it. Now, here's the crucial detail. Thutmose IV described the Sphinx as already being ancient, already being buried, already being something from a distant past. He didn't build it. He didn't discover it for the first time. He excavated it. He restored it. This was around 1400 BCE, and the Sphinx was old enough that he didn't even try to claim he built it. He acknowledged it as something from before his time, something ancient, something that deserved to be preserved. The Dream Stele is fascinating because it's an actual historical document. It's not mythology. It's not legend. It's an official inscription from a pharaoh, and it's basically saying, we found this monument. We don't know exactly when it was built. It's been here so long that sand has buried it, and now we're going to excavate it because it's important to us. That's an extraordinary admission from a ruling power. Normally, pharaohs took credit for everything. They would put their cartouche on monuments and claim them as their own. But Thutmose IV didn't do that with the Sphinx. He respected its age. He acknowledged that it was something older than Egypt's golden age. He placed his inscription between its paws, not claiming it, but honouring it. Think about what that means. If Thutmose IV, in 1400 BCE, considered the Sphinx to be ancient, so ancient that it had a legendary history, how old must it actually have been? Thutmose IV was writing about events that had already happened thousands of years earlier. He was reporting on a restoration project, not a new discovery, which means the Sphinx was already famous, already known, already integrated into the cultural memory of Egypt for at least 1,000 years before Thutmose was even born. Trace that back. That puts us closer to 2,500 or 3,000 BCE for the Sphinx to already have that status. And if it was already ancient then, the actual date of construction moves back further still. This is how we get to the water erosion hypothesis. This is how we get to Schoch's arguments for 10,500 BCE or older. The Sphinx has been excavated multiple times throughout history. During the Ptolemaic period, the Romans, the medieval era, the Ottoman era, and the modern era. Each excavation revealed more, but each one also removed evidence, and each one left behind restoration work. Modern concrete, modern repairs, modern interpretations of what the Sphinx should look like. Those repairs have actually obscured the original erosion patterns. The evidence has been partially covered up by well-intentioned archaeologists trying to preserve the monument. It's one of those situations where the attempt to save something actually obscures the secrets it holds. But before all that concrete was poured, there were people who saw the raw Sphinx, who saw the water erosion patterns, who understood what they meant. And there was one person in particular who had a vision for what might be hidden beneath it: Edgar Cayce. Now, Edgar Cayce was a mystic, a psychic, someone who operated outside mainstream archaeology. He claimed to have seen past lives and received visions. Most scientists dismiss him entirely, and I understand why. He made predictions that didn't come true. He operated in a realm of spirituality that doesn't fit with empirical science. But here's what he said about the Sphinx. He predicted that there was a hall of records buried beneath the Sphinx, a repository of knowledge from a lost civilization. He said this in the early 20th century, long before most of the modern excavations. He was very specific about the location, under the left paw. Now, the skeptic in me knows that Casey made a lot of predictions that were vague enough to be interpreted different ways. It's easy to claim insight after the fact. But here's where it gets interesting from a purely scientific standpoint. In 1991, a geophysicist named Thomas Debicki conducted a seismic survey of the Sphinx. He used instruments that send sound waves into the ground and measure how they bounce back. It's a standard technique used in geology and archaeology. And his survey found something remarkable. A rectangular chamber beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. A void space. Something hollow underneath the statue. That's not metaphysical. That's not a prediction. That's data. That's physical evidence of something beneath the Sphinx that hasn't been officially excavated. The seismic survey is important because it's reproducible. It's not dependent on interpretation. When you send sound waves into the ground and they bounce back differently from certain areas, that tells you something is there. The densities are different. There's an empty space. Debicki's findings were peer-reviewed and published. They weren't fringe science, they were legitimate geophysics. And they confirmed what Casey had predicted. Now that doesn't prove Casey was psychic, or that there's a magical hall of records under there, but it does prove that something is there. Something that deserves investigation, something that remains sealed and unexplored. Now, the official story from Zahi Hawass and other Egyptian authorities is that this chamber is probably natural. It's probably just a cavity that formed over time. Maybe it was used historically as a water reservoir or a storage space. Nothing more. Nothing to get excited about. But here's what bothers me about that explanation. If it's just a natural cavity, why hasn't it been opened and explored? If it's been there for thousands of years, if it's already been damaged or degraded, what's the harm in investigating it? The only reason not to investigate would be if there's something inside that someone doesn't want us to know about. And that raises questions. What could possibly be there that's worth keeping secret? Records? Artifacts? Evidence that contradicts the official timeline? I want to be fair to the Egyptian authorities here. They have legitimate concerns. Egypt's cultural heritage is under constant pressure from looters and treasure hunters. Not every archaeologist plays by the rules. Not every institution respects the cultural significance of these sites. So there's a natural caution about who gets to dig, who gets to explore, what happens to artifacts that are discovered. That's reasonable. That's protective. But it also means that mysteries remain unsolved, and knowledge remains hidden. There's a tension there, between preservation and exploration, between protecting heritage and understanding history, and that tension is why the Sphinx's secrets remain secrets. The Egyptian government has been restrictive about allowing digs at Giza. That's been documented. Independent researchers want to excavate. They want to use ground-penetrating radar. They want to open the shafts and chambers that have been found, and the permissions aren't granted. There are reasons for this. Cultural sensitivity, preservation concerns, questions about who has the right to explore Egypt's heritage. Those are legitimate concerns, but it also means that we don't have as much data as we could have. It means that the mystery remains partly because access is limited. We know there's a chamber there. We don't know what's in it, and the Sphinx itself has tunnels. There are passages behind the head, shafts that lead down. Some of them have been explored and documented. Others have been blocked off or are inaccessible. The Sphinx is honeycombed with passages. A structure that massive, carved out of that much bedrock, would need internal passages for various reasons. But the extent of this network, and whether they connect to deeper chambers, remains partially unknown. Some researchers have found evidence of these tunnels. Some have documented them, but full exploration has been limited. The Sphinx is a monument with secrets built into its very structure. Think about the engineering. If you're carving a statue this massive out of bedrock, you can't do it from the outside alone. You need interior support systems. You need drainage systems so water doesn't accumulate inside and crack the stone. You need passages for access during construction. And once it's built, you might use those passages for storage, or for spiritual purposes, or for whatever the culture valued. The Sphinx's internal structure would tell us a lot about its purpose and how it was built, but we can't fully explore those passages without permission and resources. We're essentially looking at a monument we can study from the outside while the interior remains largely mysterious. Here's another detail that doesn't make sense if the Sphinx was built by Khafra or another pharaoh from the Old Kingdom: the head. The Sphinx's head is disproportionately small for its body. If you look at the proportions, the head doesn't match the torso. The face looks like it's been recarved. The features don't align perfectly. The nose is missing, but not in a way that suggests erosion. It looks deliberately removed. Some researchers argue that the original head wasn't a human face at all, that it was a lion's head, that the Sphinx originally had a massive lion head matching the size of the body, and that head was later recarved into a pharaoh's face, possibly Khafra's face, when the monument was repurposed, or when a ruler wanted to claim it. Think about why you'd do that. If you're a pharaoh and you discover this ancient monument, this massive lion figure carved from a single piece of bedrock, what do? Do you leave it as is, honouring the ancient builders, or do you remake it to reflect your own power? Do you carve it into your own image? Some rulers might do that. They might carve the face, remove the nose to make their version less identifiable over time. We see this in Egyptian history, and claim the monument as their own. The body would remain unchanged because changing it would require too much effort. But the head would be modified, personalised, claimed. If this is what happened, the implications are huge. It means the Sphinx was never meant to have a human face. It was meant to be purely leonine, a lion, the king of beasts, sitting eternal and unchanging on the Giza plateau. Its original purpose was religious or symbolic in a way we don't fully understand. And then later rulers tried to domesticate it, humanize it, claim it. They added a face to match their beliefs and their politics. But the body remained, eternal and unchanged, waiting through all of this for someone to finally understand what it originally meant. If that's true, it changes everything. It means the Sphinx's original purpose was different from what we think. It means the monument was altered and reinterpreted. It means the face we see is not the original face, which means we can't use facial analysis to determine who it represents or when it was carved. We can only use the body, the erosion patterns, the geological evidence. And all of that points to something older, something that existed before human-faced pharaohs claimed it as their own, something that was repurposed and altered but never completely transformed. There's evidence for this in the sculpture itself. The transition between the face and the body is awkward. The eyes are positioned differently than they would be on a naturally proportioned face for such a large body. The ears don't align properly. These are the kinds of inconsistencies you see when a sculpture is modified, when an artist takes something that already exists and tries to alter it to match a new vision. The Sphinx shows those signs, it shows the evidence of being remade, and if you accept that, you have to accept that something came before, something older, something that someone in power decided to change and reinterpret and claim as their own. The passages and chambers beneath the Sphinx become even more significant if this is true. If the original monument was pre-dynastic, carved by a civilization before Egypt's pharaohs, then what would be stored in those chambers? Records? Artifacts? A time capsule left by the builders hidden inside their own monument? We don't know, and we can't know until someone is allowed to fully investigate. That's the frustrating part. The mystery persists not because the evidence isn't there, but because full investigation isn't permitted. The Sphinx sits in the Egyptian desert, covering its secrets, waiting. And somewhere under those massive stone paws, according to seismic surveys, there's a chamber. And we don't know what it contains. There's something poignant about that. This monument that's survived 12,000 years, that's weathered catastrophes and erosion and sand and people trying to destroy it or remake it, and it still has secrets, is not giving them up. Not yet. Maybe someday someone will get permission to fully excavate it. Maybe someday we'll know what's in those chambers. Maybe we'll find evidence that rewrites our understanding of human history. Or maybe we'll find nothing, just empty stone chambers, and the mystery will remain. But either way, the Sphinx stands, waiting, holding its secrets, watching the sun rise the same way it has for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. The water erosion patterns are the physical evidence that keeps this conversation alive. They're the reason we can't just dismiss this as fantasy or conspiracy. Rainwater running down limestone doesn't lie. Geological processes don't have agendas. The stone shows us that water did significant erosion work on the Sphinx's surface. The amount of erosion suggests time, a lot of it, more than the official timeline allows for. And no amount of debate or dismissal changes what the stone itself demonstrates. That's why this mystery endures. That's why people keep digging into it. The evidence is written in the rock itself. And that's the beautiful thing about geology. It's honest. You can't argue with a stratum of rock. You can't persuade limestone to tell a different story. The water erosion is there. The chamber beneath the pores is there. The disproportionate head is there. The dream stele, with its testimony from Thutmose IV that the Sphinx was already ancient by 1400 BCE, is there. These are physical facts. Whether you interpret them the way shock does or the way mainstream Egyptology does, the facts themselves remain. The mystery remains. And the Sphinx, standing guard over Giza, keeps watch over all of it. There's one more aspect to this that deserves mention. The Sphinx restoration projects of the recent decades have involved covering portions of the monument with concrete and modern sealants. This was done to prevent further erosion and to preserve the monument. But it also means that the original surface, the evidence that geologists and researchers used to determine the age of the Sphinx, has been partially obscured. Modern concrete covers some of the water erosion patterns. Some of the geological evidence has been sealed away. It's another layer of mystery, not intentional probably, but real. The attempt to save the Sphinx has inadvertently covered some of the clues that might tell us its true history. Future generations might not even be able to study the erosion patterns properly because modern materials have sealed them away. That's the irony of preservation. Sometimes in trying to save something, we hide the evidence it contains. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments what you think about the hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx. Are you curious? Do you want to see them excavated and explored? Now, where were we? We were talking about the Sphinx and its secrets. Let's keep going. Because the conversation gets even more interesting when we look at what the mainstream establishment has to say about all of this. So we need to talk about the pushback, because not everyone agrees with the water erosion hypothesis or shocks timeline. The mainstream archaeological establishment, particularly in Egypt, resists the idea of a much older Sphinx. And there are reasons for that resistance that aren't entirely dismissible. It's not just stubbornness or intellectual laziness. There's actual disagreement about how to interpret the evidence. There are counter-arguments, real ones. And understanding those counter-arguments actually makes the mystery more interesting, not less, because it means this isn't a simple case of establishment versus truth. It's a genuine scientific debate with legitimate perspectives on both sides. Let me be clear about something. I'm not anti-establishment. I'm not reflexively skeptical of mainstream archaeology just because it's mainstream. Mainstream archaeology exists for good reasons. It's built on centuries of rigorous methodology. It's based on evidence and documentation and peer review. Most of what we know about ancient history comes from archaeologists who did excellent work within the established framework. The skepticism I have is directed at the assumption that our current understanding is complete or untouchable. That's not skepticism toward the field itself. That's just intellectual humility. That's recognizing that every generation has blind spots, that new evidence can overturn old assumptions. That's how science progresses. Mark Lehner is probably the most respected Egyptologist working on the Giza Plateau. He's done massive amounts of fieldwork there. He's excavated, surveyed, and analysed more of Giza than almost anyone else, and his position is that the Sphinx fits perfectly into the Khafra-era construction program. Around 2500 BCE, Lehner argues that if you look at the other monuments being built during that period, the Sphinx makes sense as part of that program. The scale, the style, the engineering, the purpose, all of it aligns with what was being constructed during the Old Kingdom. He argues that attributing the Sphinx to an earlier civilization requires you to imagine a civilization that existed thousands of years earlier, left behind no other evidence, and then vanished completely. That's a big claim. That requires a lot of assumption. And in archaeology, we're generally supposed to go with the simplest explanation that fits the known evidence. Zahi Hawass, who was the head of Egyptian antiquities for many years, has been even more emphatic. He says there is no evidence of a pre-dynastic civilization at Giza. No pottery, no tools, no structures, no artifacts of any kind that would suggest people were there before the pharaohs. If the Sphinx was built by a lost civilization, where's the archaeological evidence of that civilization? Where are the settlements, the tombs, the everyday items that every human society leaves behind? Hawass argues that we're confusing a geological anomaly, the water erosion pattern, with proof of human activity from a different era. The erosion could be explained other ways, and without the supporting archaeological evidence of a pre-dynastic settlement at Giza, the older Sphinx theory is speculation, not science. That argument is harder to dismiss than you might think. Hawass has a point. If a sophisticated civilization existed at Giza, we'd expect to find more evidence of them than just one monument. We'd find the remnants of their other buildings, we'd find their cemeteries, we'd find the detritus of daily life, and we don't find those things at Giza. The archaeological record doesn't support a sustained settlement there before the Old Kingdom, so either the Sphinx is from the Old Kingdom and fits Lena's explanation, or it's from a much older era that we simply don't have archaeological evidence for. Either way, the most direct interpretation of the archaeological data supports Lena's position. But here's where it gets complicated. There's another researcher, Colin Reeder, who is a geologist. He's not a traditional archaeologist. He comes at this from a geological perspective, and he actually partially agrees with Schoch about the water erosion. He acknowledges that the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion that suggest a certain age, but he doesn't necessarily agree that it goes back to 10,500 BCE. Reeder has proposed a date of around 5,000 BCE for the Sphinx. That's still much older than the conventional timeline, but not as old as Schoch suggests. It's a middle ground. It acknowledges the geological evidence while not pushing the date back quite so far. Reeder's position is interesting because it suggests that the debate isn't really binary. It's not just Schoch versus everyone else. There are people in the middle. People who acknowledge that the Sphinx is probably older than the conventional date, but aren't willing to go as far back as 10,500 BCE. That's actually how science works. People disagree, they find middle ground, they work toward consensus slowly, and the fact that there's genuine disagreement suggests the issue is genuinely complicated. It's not settled. It's not obvious. There's real room for interpretation. One of the biggest problems with dating stone is that you can't carbon date limestone. Carbon dating works on organic material, bone, wood, plant matter. Limestone is a mineral. It doesn't contain carbon in the way that carbon dating measures, so we can't directly date when the Sphinx was carved. We can only infer from surrounding evidence. We can look at pottery from nearby sites. We can look at historical records. We can look at geological evidence like erosion patterns, but none of that is as definitive as being able to send a piece of stone to a lab and get back a date. The absence of direct dating is why the debate persists. Without that kind of definitive evidence, interpretation becomes crucial, and different people interpret the geological evidence differently. This is actually a fundamental limitation of the archaeological method when it comes to stone monuments. You can date the pottery around a building, but not the building itself. You can date the skeletons buried near a monument, but not the monument. If the construction of the Sphinx removed all the pottery and organic material from the site, if the builders cleaned it thoroughly, then future archaeologists would find almost nothing to date. The Sphinx would be like a monument in a vacuum, with no datable context around it. And that's actually what archaeologists found at Giza. The construction was clean. The preparation of the site removed most of the evidence, which means the most obvious path to dating the Sphinx through the artifacts around it is unavailable. We're left with geological inference, and inference is always open to interpretation. What would actually settle this debate? Real evidence, real proof. And there are a few things that could provide it. If we could drill core samples from the erosion channels on the Sphinx and find datable material inside them, pollen, organic matter, anything, we could potentially determine how old the erosion is. If we could access the chambers beneath the Sphinx and find artifacts inside them, we could potentially date those artifacts and understand what was stored there. If we could fully excavate the Sphinx's interior and document everything we find, we might discover something that rewrites the timeline. These are all possible, but they all require permission. They all require resources, and currently they're not happening. Think about how unusual that is from a scientific perspective. Imagine if a physicist had discovered something anomalous, but wasn't allowed to run the experiments that would explain it. Imagine if a biologist found a mysterious organism, but couldn't dissect it to understand what it was. Imagine if a geologist discovered a strange rock formation, but couldn't drill into it to examine its layers. That's essentially the situation with the Sphinx. We've found something that doesn't fit neatly into our conventional understanding. We have tools that could potentially explain it, but we can't use those tools. Not for good reasons: preservation, cultural respect, political considerations, but still, the tool remains unused. The mystery remains unsolved. And every year that passes, the concrete on the Sphinx sets harder, the original surfaces get more obscured, and the opportunity to study it in its original state gets smaller. The Sphinx restoration projects have made some of this even more difficult. When you cover portions of the original stone with concrete, you're basically saying, we're not going to study this part anymore. We're going to preserve it and move on. That's a conservation strategy, and I understand the reasoning, but it also means that certain evidence has been sealed away. The original surface has been covered. Future researchers won't be able to study those erosion patterns because they're under concrete. It's another way that the mystery is being locked away, even if unintentionally. Preservation and investigation are sometimes in tension. You can't constantly excavate and study something, and also preserve it for future generations. At some point you have to choose, and Egypt has largely chosen preservation, which means investigation is limited. But here's the thing that's starting to shift the conversation. Recent discoveries at other sites around the world are pushing the timeline of human civilization backward, not just by a few hundred years, but by thousands of years. We now know that agriculture emerged earlier than we thought, that settlements were larger than we thought, that humans were building sophisticated structures earlier than we thought. Göbekli Tepe did that. Gunung Padang did that. The discovery of submerged cities in the Indian Ocean did that. Every new discovery pushes the timeline back. Every new technology that lets us look deeper into the past reveals something older than we expected. In that context, the idea of a 12,000-year-old monument starts to feel less impossible. It fits a pattern. It fits a growing realization that human civilization is older than we used to think. The slow shift in accepted timelines is fascinating to watch if you're paying attention. 30 years ago, nobody seriously considered that civilizations existed before 3000 BCE. Now we know that settlements existed, that agriculture was being practiced, that complex social structures were emerging. 40 years ago, the idea of sophisticated stone construction before the pyramids would have been laughed out of the room. Now we point to Göbekli Tepe as unassailable proof that humans could manage impressive stonework 10,000 years ago. The boundaries keep moving. The possibilities keep expanding. Every new discovery makes the older Sphinx theory seem a little less outlandish, a little more possible, a little more worth taking seriously. This is forcing the academic world to rethink things. Slowly. Very slowly. Institutions like universities move at a glacial pace, but they do move. The very fact that Göbekli Tepe, which would have been considered fringe archaeology 25 years ago, is now taught in mainstream archaeology courses, shows that the field is evolving. What was heretical in 2000 is conventional wisdom in 2026. The timeline keeps getting pushed back. The monuments keep getting older, and the Sphinx sitting on the Giza plateau waiting might just be the biggest piece of this larger puzzle. It might be evidence of something we're only now ready to accept. There's also the question of how civilizations become lost in the first place. We assume that if a civilization was sophisticated enough to build the Sphinx, we'd find tons of evidence of them, but that assumes stable conditions. If the Younger Dryas catastrophe happened, if there were massive flooding, if settlements were wiped out, if people were displaced or killed, the archaeological record would be fragmented, it would be scattered, much of it would be underwater, much of it would be buried under sediment. Civilizations have disappeared before: Easter Island, the Mycenaean civilization, various pre-Columbian American societies. Sometimes the record is actually quite sparse despite the civilization having existed. So the argument that we should see massive archaeological evidence of a pre-Sphinx civilization isn't necessarily proof that no such civilization existed. It might just be evidence of how thorough destruction can be. The resistance from mainstream Egyptology isn't entirely unreasonable, but it's also not the final word. Institutions can be slow to change. Careers are built on the existing consensus. Questioning the timeline is questioning the framework that entire academic lives have been constructed on. That's psychologically difficult. That's professionally risky. Younger researchers sometimes have an easier time challenging the consensus because they don't have as much invested in the old paradigm. But even established researchers are starting to think about this differently. The evidence is becoming harder to ignore. It's worth remembering that mainstream academia has been wrong before, repeatedly, catastrophically. The idea that the Earth moved around the Sun was heresy. The idea that continents drifted was laughed at. The idea that ice ages existed was ridiculed. The idea that tiny microbes caused diseases was rejected. Every major shift in understanding has faced institutional resistance, not because the institutions were evil or anti-science, but because changing deeply held beliefs is hard, because it threatens the framework that careers are built on, because it requires admitting that previous generations got something wrong. Institutions can be intellectually conservative, even when they claim to value innovation. That's just human nature. It's not a conspiracy. It's just how systems work. What's fascinating is that nobody really benefits from the Sphinx being older. Egypt doesn't gain anything by admitting that something in Egypt is 12,000 years old rather than 4,500 years old. If anything, the conventional timeline is better for Egyptian national pride. It's Egypt specifically that built all these monuments. If we push the dates back further, we're suggesting that maybe there were other people, other civilizations, other powers at work in Egypt. That complicates the narrative. That takes some of the glory away from the pharaohs, so there's no conspiracy, no cover-up motivated by profit or ego. The resistance is just the normal institutional resistance to new ideas, the normal human preference for the familiar over the uncertain, which paradoxically makes it harder to change minds because there's no obvious self-interest that's distorting the debate. There's no profit motive driving the denial. There's no corporate interest protecting the conventional timeline. There's no shadowy organization suppressing the truth. It's just the normal friction of scientific institutions. It's just the weight of consensus. It's just the natural tendency of established frameworks to resist change, which actually makes the Sphinx mystery more interesting to me because it means this isn't about heroes and villains. It's about the complexity of how knowledge gets established and how it gets revised. It's about the genuine intellectual difficulties involved in dating stone monuments and inferring history from geological evidence. It's a real puzzle. And the debate around it is actually scientifically productive, even when it's frustrating. That's actually one of the reasons I find this mystery so compelling. It's genuinely uncertain. The evidence points in interesting directions, but it's not conclusive. The experts disagree in good faith. There are reasonable arguments on multiple sides, and we have the tools to settle the question, but they're not being used, not for legitimate reasons of preservation and cultural respect. But still, the mystery persists. The Sphinx knows its own age. The stone remembers when it was carved, but that memory is sealed away in geological patterns that we can only partially read and in chambers that we can't access. The truth is there. We just haven't found our way to it yet. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are supposed to last. Maybe they're supposed to remind us that we don't know everything, that history is longer and stranger and more wonderful than our textbooks suggest. The Sphinx paradox ultimately is a question about knowledge itself. How do we know what we know? What counts as evidence? How do we interpret geological data? How do we balance the need to investigate with the need to preserve? How do we challenge existing frameworks without becoming anti-science? These are the real questions beneath the surface. The water erosion hypothesis is interesting because it forces us to engage with these deeper questions. It forces us to think carefully about how we construct historical narratives. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of what we can definitively prove. And here's something I think about. The Sphinx has already outlasted multiple civilizations. It's older than Rome. It's older than Christianity. It's older than Islam. It's older than modern nations. If it's 4,500 years old, it's already survived 22 centuries of change. If it's 12,000 years old, it's survived the rise and fall of countless human enterprises. The monument outlives the explanations we construct about it. We argue about what it is, who built it, when, and meanwhile, the Sphinx just stands there, still watching, still containing its secrets, still waiting for the answers we're searching for. There's something beautiful about that, something humbling. We build monuments to last forever, but our understanding of those monuments is constantly shifting. The truth is there. We just have to be patient and clever enough to find it. So the debate continues. Mark Lehner keeps working on Giza, mapping, surveying, building the case for Old Kingdom construction. Zahi Hawass keeps arguing for the conventional timeline, based on the archaeological evidence as he interprets it. Colin Reeder keeps proposing middle ground positions, trying to find dates that fit both the geological and archaeological evidence, and Robert Schoch keeps publishing papers about the water erosion, maintaining his position on the Sphinx's age. These aren't enemies. These are scholars engaging seriously with a complex question, and that engagement, that process of debate and evidence and counter-argument, is what science is supposed to look like. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. If this helped you relax tonight, subscribe so you never miss a new video. I upload every day and there's always something new to drift off to. Tell me in the comments, do you think the Sphinx is older than Egypt? I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine standing at the Sphinx at dawn. The sun is just coming up. The light is golden, soft, hitting the monument at an angle that reveals every crevice, every detail. The wind is quiet. The tourists haven't arrived yet. It's just you and this massive limestone creature, half lion, half human, watching the sunrise the way it has watched sunrise for thousands of years. Maybe tens of thousands. The stone is cool under your hands if you touch it. You feel the weight of time in it. You feel the weight of all the hands that have touched it before you. You feel the presence of all the people who stood in this exact spot thousands of years ago and looked at it with wonder. The Sphinx's gaze is fixed on the horizon. It's looking east, toward the rising sun, toward the future. But it also carries within it the whole weight of the past. Every sunrise it's witnessed, every storm that's raged around it, every prayer that's been spoken to it, every archaeologist's hand that's touched its stone, every scholar's mind that's tried to understand it, all of that is contained in it. All of that becomes part of what it means to stand in front of it. You're not just looking at stone, you're looking at a compressed history, you're looking at time made solid. If the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, do you understand what that means? It means that the sun has risen and set over this monument 4 million times. Not once, not 100 times, 4 million times. The Earth has completed 4 million orbits since this stone was carved. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen in the time this monument has stood. Empires have conquered the world and disappeared. Technologies have been invented and forgotten, languages have evolved beyond recognition, and the Sphinx just stands there, waiting, watching, remembering. That's a staggering amount of time. That's a perspective that most of us never really grasp. Think about what that means for a moment. 4 million sunrises, each one bringing new light, each one revealing the monument anew, each one a small death and rebirth. The day comes and goes, comes and goes, comes and goes, millions of times. The Sphinx exists in that rhythm. It participates in the rhythm of the solar system. It's tuned to the Earth's rotation in a way that we're not. We sleep and wake. We age. We change. But the Sphinx just receives the sun, day after day. The same sun we see, the same light we receive thousands of years later. We're connected through that. Through the same star. Through the same light. The Sphinx is a lighthouse pointing backward in time, using the sun's light to show us where we came from. The ancient builders, whoever they were, whenever they lived, understood something about permanence. They understood that people would forget, that languages would change, that meanings would be lost. That's why they built in stone. That's why they created monuments that were so massive, so enduring, so impossible to ignore or destroy. They were trying to speak to us across time. They were trying to say, we were here, we built this, we knew things, we matter. Monuments are a message in a bottle. They're time capsules sealed in stone instead of glass. And the Sphinx is perhaps the most eloquent time capsule humanity has ever created. It speaks to us even now, thousands of years after its builders are dust, asking us to remember that we are not the first, that civilizations existed before us, that mysteries persist, that we don't have all the answers. This is why we're drawn to it. This is why it calls to us across the centuries. It's not just a statue, it's a conversation. The builders are speaking to us across thousands of years, and we're listening. We're trying to understand. We're bringing all of our technology, all of our knowledge, all of our science to bear on the question of what they meant. And still, it keeps its silence. Still, it keeps its mystery. And that silence, that mystery, is what makes it powerful. It's what makes it sacred. Because it forces us to slow down. It forces us to think. It forces us to recognize the limits of what we know. And in that recognition, we find peace. There's something comforting about that, actually. In a strange way, we live in an age of information. Everything is available. Everything is knowable. There's an answer to almost every question just a search away. But some things remain mysterious. Some questions don't have easy answers. The Sphinx is one of them. It's a monument to the limits of what we know. It's a reminder that despite all our technology, despite all our expertise, despite all our effort, some mysteries persist. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we need mysteries. Maybe they're important for us. Maybe they keep us curious. They keep us humble. They keep us reaching. In the quiet hours before sleep, when your mind is open and receptive, those mysteries feel less like problems to be solved and more like gifts. They're reminders that the universe is larger than our understanding, that there are things worth wondering about, that not everything has to be explained, categorized, understood, and moved on from. Some things can just be contemplated. Some things can just be allowed to exist in their mystery. The Sphinx is like that. You can accept it without fully understanding it. You can honor it without solving it. You can let it be. Imagine the builders, working on that monument, carving away at the stone day after day, removing millions of tons of rock to reveal the figure underneath, knowing that they were doing something that would last, not just for a few hundred years, but for thousands, for tens of thousands. That kind of faith in the future is almost incomprehensible to us now. We think in terms of quarters and years and election cycles. They thought in terms of eternity. They built as if the future mattered, as if people thousands of years from now would still want to understand what they were trying to say. And they were right. Here we are, thousands of years later, still studying their work, still trying to understand, still asking questions. There's a kind of love in that, a kind of hope. They built this without knowing if anyone would ever see it, without knowing if the civilization around them would survive, without knowing if their knowledge would be preserved or lost, and they built it anyway. They carved a lion into the desert anyway. They made it beautiful anyway. They aligned it with the stars anyway. They put their best effort into something they might never know would be appreciated or understood. That's a profound act of faith. That's a profound act of love, and we experience that love now, thousands of years later, when we stand in front of what they created. We feel it. We respond to it. We want to understand what they were trying to tell us. The Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau, and around it the world turns. Cairo expands. Technology advances. Climates shift. Politics change. Nations rise and fall, and the Sphinx remains, weathered by wind and sand and rain, damaged by earthquakes and time and human hands, restored and repaired and examined and studied, but still there, still watching, still holding its secrets. You feel small when you stand in front of it. You feel the weight of your own insignificance. You understand that you're a tiny, temporary thing in the presence of something ancient and immense, and that feeling, that shrinking of self, that perspective that comes from standing in front of something truly old. That's valuable. That's important. That's good for the soul. There's something deeply healing about feeling small. In our daily lives, we're encouraged to feel important, to center ourselves, to believe that we matter enormously. And in a way we do. Each person's life is vast and complex and important to them. But we're also part of something much larger. We're part of human history. We're part of geological time. We're part of cosmic time. And when we truly grasp that, when we let ourselves feel that vast perspective, something shifts inside us. The anxieties that seemed so pressing become smaller. The problems that seemed so unsolvable become more manageable. We're held by something larger. We're part of something that endures. And that realization can bring a kind of peace that nothing else can. The way the Sphinx watches the sunrise is the same way it watched the sunrise when it was first carved. If it was carved 12,000 years ago, it watched the sunrise before agriculture existed, before writing existed, before humans had built any city anywhere on Earth. It watched those sunrises in a world that was unimaginably different from ours, a world with different animals, different people, different languages and beliefs and ways of organizing themselves, and then it watched as everything changed. It watched as humans spread out across the world, as agriculture began, as civilizations rose, as knowledge accumulated, as technology advanced. It watched all of that, from its place on the Giza Plateau, unchanging, eternal, wise in the way that old things are wise, not because they speak, but because they endure. I want you to notice something. If you're lying in bed, getting comfortable, maybe pulling up your blankets, feel the weight of them. Feel how they're like a protective cocoon around you. That weight is comforting. That's why we like blankets. There's something soothing about that pressure, that sense of being held, the weight of fabric, the warmth trapped within it. It's like an embrace. The blanket holds you the way the earth holds the Sphinx, firmly, completely, without judgment, without demand. It's just there, supporting you, letting you rest. Now imagine the Sphinx lying down. The body's still there, the massive paws stretched out in front. It's like the Sphinx is resting, like it's comfortable in its place, like it's been there so long that it doesn't need to move anymore. It can just lie there, watching. The sand around it shifts and moves, but the Sphinx itself is stable, permanent. It's found its place. It's at rest. And in that rest there's a kind of completeness, a kind of fulfillment. The Sphinx has done what it was meant to do. It has stood, it has watched, it has endured, and now it can rest in the knowledge that its work continues, that people are still coming, still wondering, still seeking the meaning it holds. Think about what it might feel like to have stood in the same spot for 12,000 years, to never move, to never rest in the way that animals rest, to simply endure, to bear witness, to hold secrets. There's a kind of peace in that, maybe, a kind of purpose. The Sphinx doesn't need to move to accomplish what it was meant to accomplish. It just needs to exist, just needs to stand, just needs to be there, stone against sand in the Egyptian desert under the stars. The same stars that ancient people watched are still turning overhead. The constellations shift slowly, but they're still there. Orion is still there. The same Lion constellation is still there, watching over the Sphinx, watching over all of us. We're all part of something larger, something older, something that endures. There's comfort in that continuity. The Sphinx was looking at the same stars that you can see tonight. If you could somehow travel back 12,000 years and stand in front of the Sphinx on the day it was completed, the stars you would see would be the same stars in the same places. The Earth's precession changes things very slowly, and 12,000 years isn't long enough for the constellations to shift dramatically. The stars the builders watched are the stars you see. You're connected to them through that shared view, through that shared experience of looking up at the night sky and wondering. We all share that. We all participate in that ancient human experience of standing under the stars and marveling. And the Sphinx stands beneath those same stars, just as we do, just as the ancient people did, an eternal witness to the turning of the heavens. If you're still awake, still listening, let your breathing slow down. Let your thoughts become gentle and scattered, like clouds moving across a desert sky. There's no rush. There's no urgency. You can let your mind wander. You can think about the Sphinx standing in the darkness right now. It's standing in real time as you're lying here. There's a desert around it, quiet and vast. The sand is cool at night. The stars are bright because there's no light pollution. And the Sphinx stands in that darkness watching, the way it has watched for thousands of years. It's not lonely, it's not sad, it's just present. It's just there, and that's enough. Your presence matters too. The fact that you're thinking about the Sphinx right now, in this moment, while you're trying to sleep, that matters. You're continuing a conversation that spans millennia. You're part of the chain of people who have wondered about this monument, who have gazed upon it, who have asked questions about it. The builders constructed it, ancient Egyptians maintained it, modern archaeologists study it, and now you're lying in bed thinking about it. You're all part of its story, and it's part of your story. That's a beautiful kind of connection. That's a way of being together across time and space. The Sphinx has watched over countless nights. It's watched over sleepers just like you, people resting in the darkness, finding peace in rest. It's a guardian, a watcher. It's not there to threaten anyone. It's there to protect, to keep watch, to honor the memory of the ancient builders, to hold the secrets of the past, to remind us that we are part of something larger, that there are mysteries we haven't solved, that there are questions we haven't answered, and that's okay. We don't have to solve everything. We don't have to know everything. We can just rest. We can just be. We can let the ancient monument stand guard while we sleep. The desert is quiet now. The tourists are gone. The archaeologists have packed up their tools. The Sphinx stands alone in the Egyptian night, under the stars, keeping watch. The same watch it has kept for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, age after age. And somewhere beneath it, in chambers we haven't opened, in passages we haven't fully explored, there might be secrets waiting, records waiting, a message from an ancient civilization waiting to be read. Or there might be nothing, just empty stone, just the monument itself speaking through its very existence, saying, "We were here, we built this, we matter, and you matter too. You're here, you're listening, you're part of the chain that connects us to those ancient builders. The same human curiosity that drove them to carve stone drives you to listen to stories about what they carved. The same desire to understand that motivated them motivates you. You're connected to them across 12,000 years, connected to the Sphinx, connected to the desert, connected to the mystery, and right now, in this moment, you can rest in that connection. You can close your eyes and know that you're cared for, that you're safe, that the ancient guardians are watching the way they always have. The Sphinx stands eternal, the stars turn overhead, the desert breathes, and you can sleep. Tomorrow the Sphinx will be there, the mystery will still be waiting, the questions will still be unanswered, but tonight you can rest. Tonight you can let go. Let your mind drift to that ancient plateau, to that golden stone monument, to that place where time feels different, where 3,000 years doesn't feel like much at all, where eternity feels present, where the past and present and future all merge together. And in that merging, in that vast expanse of time, you can find peace, you can find rest, you can find the sleep that you're looking for. The Sphinx is still there, right now, in the darkness, watching, remembering, keeping its ancient vigil, and you are safe beneath that watch, safe in the knowledge that something older, something wiser, something more enduring than you are, is keeping guard. The monument stands, the stars turn, the desert waits. And in that waiting, in that eternal watching, there is a kind of comfort, there is a kind of peace. And that peace is yours now. That peace is what you can carry into sleep with you. The Sphinx's peace, the ancient world's peace. The peace that comes from knowing that we are small but we are loved, that we are temporary but we matter, that we will rest and the ancient monuments will keep their eternal watch over us. They always have, they always will.